The background to this project came about because no new information had been produced on storage pests since the production of this book that came out in the 1990s. The project is understanding and managing pests of stored grain. The information that came into this book was based on some surveys that took place in the 1970s and 1980s, and since that time practices have changed quite a lot, and we don't have an up-to-date understanding of what's going on in silos and in storage currently. The other part of the project is that we are reliant on a single organophosphate product, methyl, for control of pests in stored grain. With organophosphates being under increased scrutiny overseas, their long-term use is something we need to think about understanding a bit more, and also there has been resistance confirmed to methyl overseas. We have anecdotal reports of that resistance happening here in New Zealand, but nothing as yet confirmed. So it's not just FAR that's involved, we also have support from the Ministry for Primary Industry Sustainable Farming Fund and also industry and farmers. At this stage, the project is getting an idea of the frequency and distribution of pests that we have here in New Zealand, particularly focusing in on Canterbury. The idea then is to then correlate that to management practices and try and get an understanding of whether resistance is happening here in New Zealand. So it started with an initial survey. We did a primary pilot study. In that primary pilot study, growers were invited to submit grain samples, which were then analysed. We had about 60 people from across New Zealand send us grain samples, and from that about 75% of them were infected with one or more insect species. The predominant species was sawtooth grain beetle, which surprised us somewhat. We were expecting a greater incidence of weevils. We didn't find any, and the other species we found were quite a lot of soakids, so that's book lice, soft-bodied insects. Part of the problem with the initial survey is because it was an invitation survey, the people who submitted samples, we had concerns that they might already be suitably concerned about the grain in their silos, thereby bringing in some surveying bias. So stage 2 happened last year. We needed to make sure that that sampling was random to try and eliminate that sampling bias. So we had 42 growers selected at random, and we sampled their silos between September and October of last year. They did. We found that 77% of those farmers that we went back to had some level of insect infestation. We found that about 90% of them were pre-treating their grain before, or pre-treating their silos before the grain went in, and a further 79% of those were treating the grain as it went in, and the vast majority of that was with methyl. Again, we found sawtooth grain beetles and soakids were our most common, although this time we did actually find a species of weevil in one of the samples. So the majority of the pests that we found are actually secondary pests. So they are pests that will infect grain that's already had some sort of damage to it, whether it's mechanical or whether the grain has gone into the store at a slightly high temperature or a high moisture. Things like if you've harvested on a really, really hot day, the temperature of your grain can be that much higher. And if you're putting your grain into a silo that's maybe 200 or 400 tonnes, it takes a long time for that grain bulk to cool down. And these pests really love high moisture and high temperature environments. And that's one of the ways that they can get in and start breeding and replicating really quickly. There's 3 really important ways in which they can do that, and the first most important is really good hygiene practices in and around the silos. So making sure that the silo's clean, making sure that the area around the silo is clean, making sure that there's no bags of grain left hanging around or grain left in augers, because these species only need a really small amount of grain to be able to increase and breed really quickly. Another thing, a really important tool that farmers can use is aeration. So I talked about how they like to have high temperatures. If you can cool your grain using aeration, if you can cool it down to 15 degrees or lower, that's a really big thing that you can do to prevent the spread of pests. And another thing that you can do is regular monitoring. So about once a month is a good number of times to be sampling. You can run some grain off the bottom, have a look at it, expose it to a bit of light. Some species like to be exposed to a bit of light and will come out, some will hide away. Keep the samples, and you can record whether or not you have presence or absence of bugs using production wise. and those records can be stored, and also to store the sample of the grain until the grain in that silo's reached its end point. At the end of this project, we would hope that we would have resistance confirmed or not, and how to manage such a resistance if it does develop. We're also looking at best management practices and looking at the system going forward if we do lose OPs in the future, and how we can look at our system and develop it to make sure it's sustainable and robust going forward. We've just finished year 1 of the project. In 2015-16 we ran our pilot study, which fed into the current year. We have, in the last year, we've done our surveying, and we are now currently breeding up insects in our lab to conduct future resistance testing and developing a mini silo method that we're hoping to take forward into years 2 and 3.